The dust of the Wyoming Territory kicked up into a violent cloud as the wagon barreled across the unforgiving plains. Fiona Dawson's body bounced mercilessly against the hard-packed earth, her wrists bound with coarse rope to the back of the vehicle driven by the men she once called family. Each breath became a struggle as she fought to keep her head above the ground, her honey-blonde hair matted with dirt and blood, her blue calico dress torn to shreds against the rocky terrain. It was the summer of 1875, and what had begun as a dispute over her inheritance had devolved into this barbaric punishment. Her stepbrother, Edwin, had convinced their father that Fiona had stolen family heirlooms, a lie to cover his own thievery. But with their father's mind clouded by illness and whiskey, justice had become twisted beyond recognition. "You'll confess before we reach town, or you'll meet your maker trying," Edwin shouted over his shoulder, his voice barely audible over the thundering hooves and creaking wagon wheels. Fiona had long since stopped screaming. Her throat was raw, her lips cracked and bleeding. The rope burned through the skin of her wrists as she frantically tried to keep pace with the wagon. Her legs had given out miles back, and now she was simply dead weight being dragged across the merciless land. In the distance, a lone figure watched from atop a chestnut stallion. Logan Mitchell, a seasoned cowboy who'd spent the better part of his 30 years in the saddle, narrowed his eyes at the scene unfolding before him. His weathered face hardened beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "Come on, Thunder," he muttered to his horse, digging his spurs gently into the animal's flanks. The stallion leapt forward, powerful muscles bunching as they raced toward the wagon. Logan had seen his share of cruelty in the untamed West, but this display turned his stomach. As he closed the distance, he could make out the woman's form bouncing against the ground, and white-hot rage coursed through him. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the open plain. "Stop that wagon!" The driver glanced back, his expression darkening at the sight of the approaching rider. Instead of slowing, he cracked his whip against the team of horses, urging them faster. Logan leaned forward in his saddle, pushing Thunder to his limits. The stallion responded with a burst of speed that brought them alongside the wagon in moments. Without hesitation, Logan drew his revolver and fired a warning shot into the air. "I said stop!" he commanded, his voice like thunder. The wagon driver yanked hard on the reins, forcing the team to a skidding halt. The sudden stop sent the woman's body sliding forward in the dirt before coming to rest in a crumpled heap. Logan dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a thud as he kept his revolver trained on the 3 men in the wagon. "What business is this of yours, mister?" snarled the older of the men, a graying, hard-faced individual with eyes cold as winter. "When you drag a woman behind your wagon like an animal, it becomes everybody's business," Logan replied, his voice steady despite the fury boiling inside him. "Cut her loose, now." "This here is family business," the younger man Edwin protested, his hand inching toward the rifle beside him. "This woman's a thief and a liar." "I don't care if she's the devil himself," Logan said, cocking his revolver. "You cut her loose or I'll put a bullet between your eyes and do it myself." The third man, barely out of his teens, looked nervously between Logan and Edwin. "Maybe we should just let her go, Ed. This ain't worth dying over." Edwin's face contorted with rage, but the older man put a restraining hand on his arm. "Do as he says, son. We'll settle this another way." With a curse, Edwin jumped down from the wagon and stalked toward Fiona's still form. Logan kept his gun trained on him as the man roughly cut the rope binding her to the wagon. The moment she was free, Logan was at her side, holstering his weapon to gather her gently in his arms. Her face was a mask of dirt and blood, her breathing shallow. But when her eyelids fluttered open, Logan found himself staring into the most striking green eyes he'd ever seen, filled with a mixture of fear, pain, and inexplicably defiance. "You're safe now, madam," he murmured, carefully lifting her against his chest. "This isn't over," Edwin spat, backing toward the wagon. She's still our kin, and we've got rights. Your rights ended when you started dragging her like a sack of grain, Logan replied coldly. Now get out of here before I change my mind about letting you live. The older man grabbed Edwin's shoulder and pulled him back toward the wagon. Come on, son, we'll handle this proper like in town. Logan watched as they climbed back onto the wagon, turned it around, and headed back the way they'd come, dust billowing in their wake. Only when they were specks in the distance did he allow himself to fully attend to the woman in his arms. Can you hear me, madam? He asked gently. Fiona's lips parted, cracked and bleeding. Water, she whispered, the word barely audible. Logan carried her to his horse and carefully set her down in the shade of a nearby cottonwood tree. He retrieved his canteen, uncorked it with his teeth, and held it to her lips, supporting her head with his other hand. Easy now, he cautioned as she gulped desperately. Not too fast or you'll make yourself sick. She obeyed, taking smaller sips until her thirst was quenched. When she finally looked up at him properly, Logan felt something shift inside his chest. Despite the dirt and blood, he could see she was beautiful, not in the painted, artificial way of saloon girls, but with a natural grace that even her current state couldn't diminish. Thank you, she managed, her voice stronger now, though still rough from screaming. They were going to drag me all the way to Laramie. What's your name? Logan asked, tearing a strip from his bandana to dab at a cut on her forehead. Fiona Dawson. She winced as the cloth touched her wound. The older man is my stepfather, George. The angry one is my stepbrother, Edwin. The younger one is my half-brother, Thomas. And they were dragging you behind their wagon because... Logan prompted, his jaw tight with controlled anger. Because Edwin convinced George I stole our mother's jewelry. Her voice broke slightly. She died last winter. The jewelry was supposed to come to me, but Edwin took it and sold it to cover gambling debts. When I accused him, he turned it around on me. George, he's not well. His mind isn't what it was, and he believes whatever Edwin tells him. Logan nodded grimly. He'd seen such family disputes before, though few had escalated to this level of cruelty. I'm Logan Mitchell, he offered. Got a small ranch about 3 miles east of here. Can you ride? I should get you to a doctor. Fiona attempted to sit up straighter but gasped in pain. I don't know, she admitted. Everything hurts. Logan's expression softened. I'll help you. We'll take it slow. With gentle movements, he helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as she leaned heavily against him. Her dress was torn beyond repair, so he removed his duster and wrapped it around her shoulders to preserve what remained of her dignity. Getting her onto Thunder proved challenging, but Logan managed it with careful maneuvering, mounting behind her and cradling her against his chest to keep her steady. He could feel her trembling, whether from pain, fear, or both. He couldn't tell. Hold on, Miss Dawson, he murmured into her ear as he nudged Thunder into a gentle walk. I've got you. Fiona's fingers clutched weakly at the saddle horn. Where are you taking me? She asked, a note of wariness entering her voice despite her desperate situation. There's a doctor in Sweetwater, Logan replied. It's closer than my ranch. He's a good man, patched me up more times than I care to remember. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of Thunder's hooves the only sound across the vast, empty landscape. Logan was acutely aware of the woman in his arms, of how fragile she felt despite the strength he sensed within her. Why did you help me? Fiona asked suddenly, her voice small but clear. Most men would have ridden past. It wasn't your trouble. Logan considered his answer carefully. I suppose I've seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes, he finally said. When you can stop it, you should. That's all there is to it. Fiona fell silent again, but Logan felt her relax slightly against him, as though his answer had satisfied something important within her. As they approached Sweetwater, the small town's buildings emerged from the haze of distance: a church steeple, the two-story hotel, the squat shape of the saloon. People stopped and stared as Logan rode down the main street with Fiona cradled before him, her condition obvious despite his duster covering her. He rained thunder to a stop outside a small clapboard building with a weathered sign identifying it as Dr. James Warren's office. Before Logan could dismount, the door swung open and a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose appeared on the porch. "Good Lord, Mitchell, what have you gotten yourself into now?" Dr. Warren exclaimed. Then his expression changed as he caught sight of Fiona. "Bring her in, quickly." Logan dismounted and carefully lifted Fiona from the saddle. She whimpered softly as the movement jostled her injuries, but made no other complaint. He carried her into the doctor's office, laying her gently on the examination table as directed. "What happened to her?" Dr. Warren demanded, already gathering supplies. "Found her being dragged behind a wagon," Logan said grimly. "Her own kin, if you can believe it." The doctor's face darkened. "I've heard of such barbaric punishment but never seen it myself." He turned to Fiona. "Miss, I need to examine your injuries. Logan, perhaps you should wait outside." Fiona's hand shot out suddenly, gripping Logan's wrist with surprising strength. "Please stay," she whispered, fear evident in her eyes. I don't want to be alone." Logan looked to the doctor, who nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but turn your back while I examine her more thoroughly." For the next hour, Logan stood facing the wall as Dr. Warren cleaned and treated Fiona's numerous injuries, listening to her occasional gasps and whimpers with a growing knot of anger in his stomach. The doctor's running commentary painted a grim picture: abrasions covering most of her back and legs, 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder that needed setting, and dehydration that bordered on dangerous. "You're lucky this man found you when he did," Dr. Warren told Fiona as he finished bandaging her wrists. "Much longer, and I might have been treating you for far worse than these injuries." "Can she be moved?" Logan asked, turning around now that Fiona was decently covered with a blanket. The doctor frowned. "Ideally, no. She needs rest and constant care for at least a few days. But I suspect those men might come looking for her, and my small office isn't exactly defensible." Fiona's face paled at the mention of her family. "They will come," she said quietly. "Edwin won't let this go. He needs me to confess to the theft or he'll be found out eventually." Logan's jaw tightened. "Then she'll come to my ranch. It's isolated enough, and I can keep her safe there until she's healed." "And then what?" Dr. Warren asked pointedly. "What becomes of her afterward?" It was a fair question, and one Logan hadn't considered in his rush to help. He looked at Fiona, seeing the same question in her eyes. "We'll figure that out when the time comes," he said finally. "For now, she needs somewhere safe to recover." The doctor sighed. "I suppose that's the best option. I'll give you some medicines and instructions for her care." He turned to Fiona. "Miss, are you agreeable to this arrangement? I don't want to send you somewhere against your will, even with the best intentions." Fiona looked at Logan, studying his face as though searching for something. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll go with Mr. Mitchell." "Logan," he corrected gently, "if we're going to be sharing a roof, you might as well use my given name." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Logan," she repeated softly. Dr. Warren busied himself preparing a bundle of medicines and bandages, along with detailed instructions for Fiona's care. As he worked, he spoke quietly to Logan. "She'll need help with everything for a few days. Dressing, bathing, even eating might be difficult with those wrists. Are you prepared for that?" Logan nodded solemnly. "I nursed my father through his final illness. I know what's needed." The doctor regarded him for a long moment. "I believe you do. But there's also her reputation to consider. a single woman staying with a bachelor. My housekeeper, Mrs. Grayson, lives on the property, Logan assured him. She's a respectable widow who can act as chaperone and help with Fiona's care. This seemed to satisfy the doctor, who finished packing his supplies. Very well, I'll come check on her in a few days, assuming the weather holds. The sun was beginning to set by the time they left Sweetwater, Fiona now dressed in a simple calico dress the doctor had procured from his wife. She sat before Logan on Thunder once again, but this time wrapped in a proper blanket, her bandaged wrists resting in her lap. It's not much farther, Logan assured her as they rode eastward, the land gradually rising toward the foothills. My place isn't grand, but it's comfortable enough. Fiona nodded, too exhausted for conversation. Logan could feel her occasionally slump against him as she drifted toward sleep, only to jerk awake again with a small gasp of pain. It's all right, he murmured each time. You can rest. I've got you. By the time they reached his ranch, night had fallen completely. The small, sturdy cabin sat nestled against a backdrop of pine trees, with a barn and corral nearby. A lantern glowed in the window, indicating Mrs. Grayson was still awake and waiting. As Thunder approached, the front door opened, spilling warm light onto the porch. A stout woman in her 50s appeared, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Logan Mitchell, what on earth kept you so long? I was about to send out a search party, she called, then faltered as she caught sight of Fiona. Good heavens, who's this? Logan dismounted and carefully lifted Fiona down. Mrs. Grayson, this is Miss Fiona Dawson. She's been injured and needs our help. Miss Dawson, this is Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, my housekeeper and the finest cook in the Wyoming Territory. Despite her obvious surprise, Mrs. Grayson recovered quickly, her expression softening as she took in Fiona's battered state. You poor dear. Come inside at once. I'll heat some water and prepare a proper bed for you. Logan carried Fiona into the cabin, which consisted of a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to separate bedrooms. Everything was simple, but clean, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts adding warmth to the rustic space. Put her in my room, Mrs. Grayson directed, already bustling about. I'll take the small room off the kitchen. That's not necessary, Logan began, but the housekeeper cut him off with a wave of her hand. It absolutely is. The poor girl needs a proper bed, not that lumpy cot I sleep on. Besides, my room is closer to the kitchen, easier for me to tend to her during the night. Logan knew better than to argue with Mrs. Grayson when her mind was made up. He carried Fiona into the bedroom, laying her gently on the patchwork quilt. She looked impossibly small and fragile against the sturdy oak bed frame, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and pain. Thank you, she whispered as he stepped back to let Mrs. Grayson take over. For everything. Logan nodded, suddenly awkward. Get some rest. You're safe here. He retreated to the main room, settling heavily into a chair by the fire. The events of the day replayed in his mind as he stared into the flames, the sight of Fiona being dragged behind that wagon, the murderous rage he'd felt toward the men responsible, the strange protective instinct that had overtaken him. It wasn't like him to get involved in other people's business. The West was full of hardship and cruelty, and a man could drive himself mad trying to right every wrong. Yet something about Fiona Dawson had compelled him to act, to bring her into his home and life without a second thought. Mrs. Grayson emerged from the bedroom some time later, drying her hands on her apron. She's asleep, the housekeeper reported, her voice low. I've given her the medicine the doctor sent along. Poor thing could barely stay awake long enough to take it. She fixed Logan with a penetrating stare. Now, suppose you tell me exactly what happened. Logan did, recounting the day's events in his straightforward manner. As he spoke, Mrs. Grayson's expression shifted from shock to outrage to grim determination. Well, she'll stay here as long as she needs to, the woman declared when he'd finished. And if those so-called family members of hers come sniffing around, they'll get a taste of my shotgun. Logan couldn't help but smile at the fierceness of his normally placid housekeeper. I don't think it will come to that, but I appreciate the sentiment. Mrs. Grayson huffed. Men like that rarely give up easily. You mark my words, Logan Mitchell, this isn't over. She moved toward the small room off the kitchen. Now get some sleep. You look dead on your feet, and tomorrow will bring its own troubles. Logan nodded, though he doubted sleep would come easily. After Mrs. Grayson retired, he checked on Thunder, made sure the cabin was secure, and finally stretched out on the sofa by the dying fire, his revolver within easy reach. As he drifted toward sleep, the image of Fiona's green eyes stayed with him, the pain and fear in them. Yes, but also that spark of defiance that had somehow survived the day's horrors. There was strength in her, he realized, a resilience that went beyond physical endurance. Whatever came next, Logan had a feeling Fiona Dawson was going to surprise them all. Morning came with the soft golden light of dawn filtering through the cabin windows. Logan woke instantly, as was his habit from years on the trail. For a moment, he was disoriented by the sight of his own living room ceiling. Then the events of the previous day rushed back to him. He sat up, running a hand through his disheveled dark hair. The house was quiet except for the soft sounds of Mrs. Grayson moving about in the kitchen. Logan rose and moved to check on Fiona, pausing at the bedroom door to knock softly. When there was no answer, he eased the door open slightly. Fiona lay exactly as he'd left her the night before, her breathing deep and even. The morning light illuminated her face, which looked marginally better after being cleaned of dirt and blood. Her honey blonde hair had been brushed and braided by Mrs. Grayson, framing her face in a way that softened the worst of the bruising. Satisfied that she was resting comfortably, Logan retreated, closing the door silently behind him. She's still sleeping, he reported to Mrs. Grayson as he entered the kitchen. The housekeeper nodded, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove. Good. Sleep's the best medicine for her now. I checked on her through the night, changed her bandages once when the bleeding started up again, gave her more of that pain powder when she woke crying. Logan frowned. She was in that much pain? Bound to be, with injuries like that. Mrs. Grayson shook her head. What kind of men do such things to their own kin? It's ungodly. That's what it is. Logan couldn't disagree. He accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Grayson handed him and took a long swallow, letting the bitter warmth chase away the last remnants of sleep. I need to tend to the stock and check the property, he said after a moment. Will you be all right with her if I'm gone for a few hours? Mrs. Grayson gave him a look that made him feel about 10 years old. I raised 4 children and nursed my Henry through 2 bullet wounds and a broken back. I think I can manage 1 injured girl. Logan held up his hands in surrender. I never doubted it. After a quick breakfast, he headed out to begin his chores. The ranch was small by Wyoming standards, just 80 acres, with a modest herd of cattle and a few horses, but it was his, free and clear. Logan had worked cattle drives and broken horses for 15 years to save enough to buy this place, and he took pride in every fence post and corral rail. As he rode the perimeter, checking for any signs of intruders or predators, his thoughts kept returning to Fiona. What would happen when she recovered? She clearly couldn't return to her family, but where would she go? A single woman without family or means had few options in the West, none of them particularly appealing. By midday, he'd completed his rounds and returned to the cabin, surprised to find Fiona awake and sitting in a chair by the fire, propped up with pillows. She looked pale but alert, dressed in one of Mrs. Grayson's nightgowns with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Mr. Mitchell, she greeted him, attempting to straighten up before wincing in pain. Logan, he corrected gently, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. How are you feeling? Better than I expected, she admitted. Mrs. Buck, Grayson has been very kind. The housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray with bowls of soup. The girl needed to sit up for a while. Lying abed all day leads to all sorts of complications. Logan nodded, knowing Mrs. Grayson's firm beliefs about the healing powers of fresh air and activity. Still, he could see the pain in Fiona's eyes despite her brave front. "Have you seen any sign of them?" Fiona asked quietly as Mrs. Grayson returned to the kitchen. Logan shook his head. "Nothing. But that doesn't mean they're not looking." Fiona's hands trembled slightly as she attempted to lift her soup spoon, the bandages on her wrists making the simple task difficult. Without comment, Logan moved to sit beside her, gently taking the spoon from her grasp. "Allow me," he said, his voice gruff with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Fiona hesitated, a flash of pride crossing her features before reality set in. She nodded once, allowing him to help her with the soup. "I'm not usually so helpless," she said after a few spoonfuls. "I've taken care of myself since my mother died." "There's no shame in accepting help when it's needed," Logan replied. "We all have times when we can't manage alone." "Is that why you helped me yesterday? Because you've needed help yourself before?" The question caught him off guard with its perceptiveness. Logan considered his answer carefully as he continued to feed her the soup. "Perhaps," he acknowledged. "I've been in bad spots before. Once, I was caught in a blizzard up in Montana Territory. Would have frozen to death if a Crow family hadn't found me and taken me in. They had no reason to help a white stranger, but they did." "And you've been repaying that debt ever since?" Logan's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I suppose you could see it that way." They fell into comfortable silence as he helped her finish the soup. When the bowl was empty, Logan set it aside and noticed Fiona struggling to keep her eyes open. "You should rest more," he said, rising to his feet. Dr. Warren was clear about that. Fiona nodded, but made no move to return to the bedroom. Would it be all right if I stayed here a while longer? The sound of the fire is comforting." "Of course." Logan fetched a quilt from the back of the sofa and carefully draped it over her lap. "I'll be outside if you need anything. Mrs. Grayson is just in the kitchen." Fiona caught his hand as he turned to leave, her fingers light against his calloused palm. "Thank you, Logan. Truly." He nodded, strangely affected by the simple touch, and gently extricated himself before heading back outside. The next few days fell into a rhythm of sorts. Fiona grew stronger by small increments, graduating from soup to solid food, from sitting in a chair to taking short, painful walks around the cabin with Mrs. Grayson's support. Her wrists began to heal, though the rope burns had cut deep enough that the doctor, when he visited, warned there would likely be permanent scarring. Logan kept his distance as much as possible, aware of the impropriety of the situation despite Mrs. Grayson's presence. But in the evenings, after chores were done, they would often sit together by the fire while Mrs. Grayson knitted nearby, talking about inconsequential things, the weather, the horses, books they had read. He learned that Fiona had been educated in St. Louis before her mother remarried and brought her west. She could read and write better than most men he knew, and had a quick mind for figures and facts. In turn, he told her about his years on cattle drives, the characters he'd met, the places he'd seen. What he didn't tell her was how he found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, noticing the way the firelight caught in her hair, or how her rare smile transformed her face. He didn't mention the protective instinct that surged whenever she winced in pain, or how he'd taken to riding the perimeter of his property twice daily, watching for any sign of her family. A week after bringing Fiona to the ranch, Logan rode into Sweetwater for supplies and information. The small town was buzzing with gossip about the incident, and he soon learned that Edwin and George Dawson had indeed been asking questions about a missing woman. "Told them I hadn't seen hide nor hair of any young lady," the general store owner informed Logan as he packed up flour and coffee. "Didn't like the look of them, especially that younger one, eyes like a rattlesnake. Logan nodded his thanks, paying for his supplies. If they come back, you never saw me either. The store owner tapped the side of his nose knowingly. Understood, Mitchell. Word around town is they're staying at the Laramie Hotel, drinking heavily and making threats. Sheriff's keeping an eye on them, but there's not much he can do unless they actually break the law. Armed with this information, Logan finished his errands quickly and headed back to the ranch, arriving as the sun began to set. He found Fiona sitting on the porch, wrapped in a quilt despite the warm evening air, staring out at the darkening land. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, dismounting and securing Thunder to the hitching post. "It's not safe." "Mrs. Grayson is just inside," Fiona replied, her eyes still on the distant mountains. "And I needed to feel the wind. I've been indoors too long." Logan set his supplies on the porch and leaned against the railing, studying her profile. The bruises on her face had faded to yellowing smudges, and some of the haunted look had left her eyes. She was healing, physically at least. "They're in Laramie," he said without preamble. "Your stepfather and Edwin, asking questions." Fiona's hands tightened on the quilt, but her voice remained steady. "I knew they would be. Edwin can't afford to let this go." She finally turned to look at him. "I should leave. I'm putting you and Mrs. Grayson in danger by staying here." "And go where?" Logan challenged. "With no money, no transportation, and injuries that aren't fully healed?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I can't hide forever." Logan shook his head. "You're not going anywhere until you're fully recovered. After that, we'll figure something out." Fiona studied him with those penetrating green eyes. "Why are you doing all this for me, Logan?" The truth this time. The question hung between them in the gathering darkness. Logan pushed away from the railing and moved to sit beside her on the porch step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Because from the moment I saw you being dragged behind that wagon, something inside me changed," he said quietly, the words difficult to form. "I've spent most of my life alone, keeping to myself, minding my own business. But when I saw what they were doing to you, I couldn't ride past. I couldn't look away. And now that I know you, I can't let you face them alone." Fiona's eyes glistened in the fading light. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Logan replied simply. Before she could respond, the door opened behind them and Mrs. Grayson appeared. "Supper's ready," she announced. "And Miss Fiona, you shouldn't be out in the evening air. Your lungs are still healing." The moment broken, Logan rose and offered Fiona his hand. She took it, allowing him to help her to her feet. For a brief moment, their fingers remained intertwined, a silent acknowledgement of something neither was ready to name. The following morning, Logan was chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard the distant sound of approaching horses. He set down his axe and moved to the corner of the building, shading his eyes against the bright sunlight. 3 riders were approaching from the west, still far off, but moving with purpose toward the ranch. Even at this distance, Logan recognized the lead rider's posture. Edwin Dawson had found them. He moved quickly into the cabin, where Fiona was helping Mrs. Grayson peel potatoes, her bandaged hands now capable of simple tasks. "They're coming," he said, without preamble. 3 riders from the west. One is Edwin." The color drained from Fiona's face, but she set down her knife with a steady hand. "How did they find us?" "Small towns have big ears," Logan replied grimly. "Someone must have talked." He turned to Mrs. Grayson. "Get my rifle from the bedroom, then take Fiona to the root cellar and stay there until I come for you." The housekeeper nodded, her usual chatter silenced by the gravity of the situation. She hurried to fetch the rifle while Logan checked his revolver. "You don't have to face them," Fiona said, her voice tight with fear. "This is my fight. Not yours." Logan looked up at her, his expression softening despite the tension of the moment. It became my fight the moment I cut you free, he said simply. Now go with Mrs. Grayson, please. After a moment's hesitation, Fiona nodded. Mrs. Grayson returned with the rifle, and Logan watched as the two women hurried out the back door toward the small root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin. Taking a deep breath, Logan positioned himself on the porch, rifle in hand, as the riders approached. He recognized all three now, Edwin in the lead, followed by George Dawson and the younger brother, Thomas. They reined in their horses about 20 yards from the cabin, dust rising around them in the still morning air. "Mitchell," Edwin called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "We know you've got her. Send her out and there won't be any trouble." "There's already been trouble," Logan replied evenly. "The kind that would get a man hanged in any civilized territory." George Dawson urged his horse forward a few steps. He looked older than Logan remembered, his face haggard and confused. "We just want to take our daughter home. This is a family matter." "Family doesn't drag a woman behind a wagon until she's half dead," Logan countered. "Miss Dawson is recovering from her injuries. She's not going anywhere with you." Edwin's face darkened with rage. "She's coming with us if I have to burn this place to the ground to get her." His hand moved toward the gun at his hip. "I wouldn't," Logan warned, raising his rifle slightly. "I was dropping buffalo at 500 yards when you were still in short pants, boy. You won't clear leather before you're dead." A tense silence fell over the yard. Logan could see Edwin weighing his options, the rage in his eyes battling with self-preservation. Thomas shifted nervously on his horse, looking between his brother and Logan with growing alarm. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed," Logan continued, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Turn around and ride away. Forget about Fiona. She's not your concern anymore." "She's my stepdaughter," George insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I have a right." "You lost any rights to her when you allowed this to happen," Logan cut him off. "A real father protects his children. He doesn't torture them to satisfy another's greed." George flinched as though struck, and Logan pressed his advantage. "You know what Edwin did. Deep down, you know he took that jewelry and blamed Fiona for it. Are you willing to die for his lie? To kill for it?" Uncertainty flickered across George's weathered face. He turned to Edwin, who was watching him with narrowed eyes. "Is it true?" George asked, his voice suddenly clear and sharp. "Did you take Margaret's jewelry?" "Don't listen to him, Pa," Edwin snarled. "He's just trying to turn us against each other." But something had changed in George's demeanor. He straightened in his saddle, years of weakness falling away as clarity returned to his gaze. "Answer me, boy. Did you take your stepmother's jewelry and blame Fiona for it?" The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, with a curse, Edwin drew his gun, not aiming at Logan, but at his own father. Logan's rifle cracked before Edwin could fire, the bullet striking the man's shoulder and spinning him backward off his horse. He hit the ground with a thud and a howl of pain, his unfired gun landing in the dust beside him. Thomas jumped from his horse and rushed to his brother's side, while George sat frozen in his saddle, staring at his son with dawning horror. "It's not a killing wound," Logan called out, rifle still trained on the fallen man. "But the next one will be if he reaches for that gun again." Edwin clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face contorted with pain and rage. "You'll pay for this, Mitchell," he gasped. "I'll see you hang." "The only one facing a hangman's noose is you," came a new voice from behind Logan. He glanced back to see Fiona standing on the porch, Mrs. Grayson hovering anxiously behind her. She had evidently disobeyed his instructions to stay hidden, but Logan couldn't find it in himself to be angry. She stood tall despite her injuries, facing her tormentors with a courage that made his heart swell. "Hello, George," she said, her voice steady as she addressed her stepfather. "As you can see, I'm alive. No thanks to you." George Dawson seemed to age before their eyes, his shoulders slumping under the weight of what he'd allowed to happen. Fiona, I don't know what to say. I let Edwin convince me. The whiskey clouded my judgment. It wasn't just the whiskey, Fiona replied coldly. It was weakness. Weakness and the fact that you never truly accepted me as your daughter. Even after all these years. She descended the porch steps slowly, moving to stand beside Logan. Without taking his eyes off Edwin, Logan shifted slightly to keep his body between her and potential danger. The jewelry Edwin stole belonged to my mother, Fiona continued. It was meant for me, her only blood relative. But that's not why he dragged me behind that wagon. He did it because I threatened to expose his gambling debts to you. Debts that will likely cost you the ranch, if they haven't already. George's face crumpled. The ranch is gone, he admitted. Edwin mortgaged it to the bank in Cheyenne 3 months ago. We're being foreclosed on next week. Edwin struggled to his feet, shrugging off Thomas's supporting arm. Shut up, old man, he growled. None of this would have happened if you hadn't married that woman in the first place. Her and her precious daughter, looking down on us like we were dirt beneath their feet. That's not true, Fiona said quietly. My mother loved George, and I tried to be a good stepdaughter despite your cruelty. Thomas, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke up. She's right, Pa. Edwin's been lying to all of us. I should have said something when he tied Fiona to the wagon, but I was afraid. He looked at Fiona, his young face etched with remorse. I'm sorry, Fiona. I was a coward. Edwin lunged for his brother, but the movement sent a fresh wave of blood pouring from his wounded shoulder, and he staggered. You ungrateful little... Enough, Logan interrupted, his voice like a whip crack. Here's what's going to happen. Thomas is going to take Edwin to the doctor in Sweetwater. You, George, can go with them or not, that's your choice. But none of you are coming back here. Ever. He looked to Fiona for confirmation, and she nodded, her expression resolute. I have nothing more to say to any of you, she said. Whatever family we might have been is gone now. George slumped further in his saddle, the fight gone out of him entirely. I understand, he said hollowly. For what it's worth, Fiona, I am sorry. More sorry than you can know. Fiona said nothing, her face impassive. After a moment, George dismounted and helped Thomas get Edwin back on his horse. The wounded man was pale from blood loss, but still conscious enough to glare hatred at Logan and Fiona. This isn't over, Edwin muttered through clenched teeth. Yes, it is, George said with sudden firmness. You've done enough damage, son. We're leaving now, and we won't be back. Mr. Mitchell, I give you my word on that. Logan nodded once, rifle still at the ready. See that you keep it. They watched in silence as the 3 men rode away, Edwin slumped in his saddle between his father and brother. Only when they were specks in the distance did Logan lower his rifle and turn to Fiona. Are you all right? He asked quietly. She nodded, though her face was pale and drawn. I will be. I had to face them. I had to show them I wasn't afraid anymore. You were magnificent, he said simply. The admiration in his voice brought a flush to her cheeks. She swayed slightly, the emotional toll of the confrontation catching up with her weakened body, and Logan instinctively reached out to steady her. Come inside, he urged gently. You need to rest. Mrs. Grayson bustled forward to help, clucking with concern. I told you to stay in the root cellar, young lady. You could have been shot. Fiona allowed them to guide her back into the cabin, but her eyes remained on Logan. Thank you, she said, for standing between me and them, for being willing to fight for me. Logan shook his head. You fought your own battle today, Fiona. I just provided the rifle. For the first time since he'd known her, Fiona Dawson smiled fully, a radiant expression that transformed her face and sent an unexpected warmth spreading through Logan's chest. Nevertheless, she said softly, I'm grateful it was your rifle. The days following the confrontation brought a noticeable change in Fiona. With the immediate threat of her family removed, she seemed to shed a layer of tension, becoming more animated in conversation and even laughing occasionally at Mrs. Grayson's stories. Her physical recovery accelerated as well. Within 2 weeks, she was moving about the cabin with minimal discomfort, helping with light chores, despite Mrs. Grayson's protests. The rope burns on her wrists had healed into pink scars that would fade with time, though never disappear completely. Logan found himself increasingly drawn to her presence. He began lingering over meals, finding excuses to remain in the cabin rather than attending to ranch work that could wait. They spent evenings talking by the fire long after Mrs. Grayson had retired, sharing stories of their lives and discovering a surprising number of common interests despite their different backgrounds. It was during one such evening, nearly a month after he'd first found her being dragged across the Wyoming plains, that Logan finally broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. Have you given any thought to what you'll do now? He asked, watching her face in the flickering firelight. You're nearly healed. You could travel if you wanted to. Fiona's hand stilled in her lap, where she'd been mending one of his shirts. I've been thinking about it, she admitted. I have a cousin in Denver who might take me in, at least temporarily. Or I could try to find work as a teacher somewhere. I had some training for that in St. Louis. Logan nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest at the thought of her leaving. Both sound like good options. They do, she agreed, but there was a hesitancy in her voice that gave him pause. But? He prompted gently. Fiona set aside her sewing and looked directly at him, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. But I've also considered staying here. In Wyoming, I mean. I've grown fond of it. Logan's heart quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. Wyoming can be harsh. Winters are brutal. It's not an easy place for a woman alone. I wouldn't be alone, she said quietly. Not if you didn't want me to be. The implication hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. Logan set down his coffee cup carefully, suddenly aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Fiona, he began, his voice rougher than he intended. If you're suggesting what I think you are, I'm suggesting that I care for you, she said with surprising directness. And I believe you care for me too. Perhaps it's unconventional how we met, the circumstances that brought us together. But I've never felt safer or more valued than I have here with you. Logan rose from his chair and moved to kneel before her, taking her scarred hands gently in his. I do care for you, he admitted. More than I thought possible after knowing someone for such a short time. But I need to be certain this isn't gratitude you're feeling, or a sense of obligation. Fiona's lips curved into a small smile. I've had a great deal of time to think these past weeks, Logan, to sort through my feelings and understand them. What I feel for you began as gratitude. Yes, but it's grown into something else. Entirely. Something I've never felt before. She freed one hand to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. You saw me at my weakest, my most vulnerable. You could have taken advantage. But instead, you showed me nothing but respect and kindness. You fought for me when no one else would. How could I not fall in love with such a man? The word love sent a jolt through Logan's body. He captured her hand against his face, turning to press a kiss into her palm. I never expected to find you, he said softly. I'd resigned myself to a solitary life. But from the moment I held you in my arms, something changed. I couldn't bear the thought of letting you go. Fiona leaned forward until their foreheads touched. Then don't, she whispered. The kiss that followed was gentle, mindful of injuries not yet fully healed, but filled with a promise that made words unnecessary. When they finally drew apart, Logan found himself smiling in a way he hadn't in years. Mrs. Grayson will be scandalized, he murmured, though the twinkle in his eye suggested he wasn't overly concerned. Fiona laughed softly. Mrs. Grayson has been dropping hints about wedding plans for 2 weeks now. I think she'll manage to contain her shock. Logan joined in her laughter, marveling at how natural it felt to share this moment of joy with her. She's a wise woman, sees things before the rest of us catch on. Growing serious again, he took both her hands in his. I don't have much to offer you, Fiona. This ranch is small, the work is hard, and I'm not a wealthy man. But everything I have is yours, if you want it. I don't need wealth, she replied simply. I need a home, someone to build a life with, someone who sees me for who I am and values me accordingly. Then marry me, Logan said, the words coming easily now that his heart was certain. Stay here and be my wife. Let me spend the rest of my days making sure you never know fear or pain again. Tears welled in Fiona's eyes, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Logan Mitchell. He gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of her still healing ribs, and held her close against his heart, where she had resided since the day he cut her free. News of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Dr. Warren, upon hearing of it during a final check of Fiona's injuries, pronounced himself unsurprised, but thoroughly pleased. Mrs. Grayson, as predicted, revealed that she had been planning for this outcome almost from the beginning, producing a half-finished wedding quilt from her trunk as evidence. The wedding itself was a simple affair, held on a perfect autumn day 6 weeks after Logan's proposal. They exchanged vows in the small white church in Sweetwater, with Mrs. Grayson, Dr. Warren, and a handful of Logan's neighbors as witnesses. Fiona wore a modest ivory dress ordered from a catalog in Cheyenne, with her honey blonde hair adorned with wildflowers gathered that morning. As they spoke their promises to one another, Logan found himself remembering that terrible first sight of Fiona being dragged across the plains. The contrast between that moment and this one, Fiona standing before him whole and radiant, her green eyes clear and filled with love, struck him with such force that his voice faltered briefly. She squeezed his hands in understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them here. The past could not be erased, but it had led them to each other, and for that, Logan found himself strangely grateful. The small reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and Mrs. Grayson presiding over a feast that would be talked about for months afterward. As the afternoon light began to fade, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone at last. Logan found Fiona standing on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. He moved to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and drawing her back against his chest. Are you happy, Mrs. Mitchell? He murmured against her ear. She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face with a tenderness that still amazed him. Happier than I ever thought possible, she replied. Are you? More than I have words to express, he said honestly. I never expected to find someone to share this life with. Now I can't imagine it without you. Fiona's smile held a hint of mischief. Well, you're stuck with me now, Cowboy. For better or worse? Definitely for better, Logan replied, lowering his head to capture her lips in a kiss that conveyed all the love and promise he held in his heart. As the stars began to appear in the darkening Wyoming sky, Logan Mitchell led his bride into their home, not the place where he had brought her broken and bleeding, but a new beginning forged from courage, compassion, and an unexpected love that had bloomed in the harshest of circumstances. The years that followed were not without challenges. The Wyoming Territory remained a demanding place to carve out a living, with harsh winters, occasional drought, and the constant work required to maintain a ranch. But Logan and Fiona faced each obstacle together, their bond strengthening with every hardship overcome. Mrs. Grayson remained with them for another 2 years before retiring to live with her daughter in Colorado. By then, Fiona had fully taken on the role of ranch mistress, proving herself as capable in managing household affairs as she was in helping with the livestock when needed. Her education also proved valuable. She kept meticulous accounts and corresponded with cattle buyers in a hand that impressed even the most hardened businessmen. Their first child, a daughter they named Margaret after Fiona's mother, arrived in the spring of 1877, followed 2 years later by a son, James. The children grew strong and healthy in the clean mountain air, learning to ride almost before they could walk, their laughter filling the once quiet cabin with a joy Logan had never thought to experience. As for Edwin and George Dawson, they faded into memory like a bad dream. News occasionally reached them Edwin had moved to California after recovering from his wound. George had died quietly in a Cheyenne boarding house the winter after the confrontation. Thomas, the youngest brother, surprised them by writing to Fiona a year after her marriage, asking for forgiveness and telling her of his new life working on a ranch in Texas. She responded with cautious warmth, and over time, a tentative correspondence developed between them. "Do you ever regret it?" Logan asked Fiona one evening in their 5th year of marriage, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The children were already asleep inside, exhausted from a day of helping their father with the spring calves. "Regret what?" she asked, looking up from the book in her lap. "Staying here. Marrying a rough cowboy instead of finding a more civilized life back east." Fiona set aside her book and moved to sit on his lap, her fingers threading through his hair, now showing the first strands of silver at the temples. "Not for a single moment," she said with quiet conviction. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." Logan tightened his arms around her, still marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "Even when the roof leaks and the cattle break through the north fence and little James decides to bring skunks into the house?" She laughed, the sound as beautiful to him now as it had been the first time he'd heard it. "Even then. Perhaps, especially then." Her expression grew more serious as she traced the lines of his face with gentle fingers. "You saved me, Logan. Not just my life, but my spirit. You showed me what love truly is, not possession or control, but freedom and respect. How could I ever regret choosing that?" "I think we saved each other," he replied, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm, where the last faint traces of rope scars remained. "I was alone for so long, I'd forgotten what it meant to share a life with someone, to have a family." Fiona leaned forward to rest her forehead against his, a gesture that had become familiar and cherished over their years together. "Then we're even," she whispered, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Logan Mitchell held his wife close, grateful beyond words for that terrible day when he'd spotted a woman being dragged behind a wagon across the Wyoming plains. What had begun in cruelty and violence had transformed into something beautiful and enduring, a love story written not in the pages of a book, but in the shared moments of a life built together, day by day, through hardship and joy alike. And as the years continued to pass, as their children grew and the small ranch prospered under their joint care, Logan and Fiona Mitchell remained each other's strength and solace, their love a testament to the human capacity for healing and the unexpected paths that lead us home. On the 10th anniversary of the day Logan had cut Fiona free from that wagon, they stood together on a hill overlooking their expanded property, now 200 acres, with a larger herd and a new, more spacious home built with their own hands. "Did you ever imagine this?" Fiona asked, her arm linked through his, her head resting against his shoulder. At 35, she was more beautiful to him than ever, the years having added character and confidence to her features without diminishing her grace. Logan gazed out at the land that had become their legacy, the grazing cattle, the sturdy barns, the house where their children, now 3, with the addition of little Elizabeth 4 years earlier, slept soundly. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I thought I'd live and die alone on a small patch of land with no one to remember my name afterward." Fiona squeezed his arm gently. "And instead?" He turned to her, his heart still filling with wonder at the sight of her face. "Instead, I found everything I never knew I was missing. A woman brave enough to survive the unthinkable, strong enough to build a new life from the ashes of the old, and generous enough to share that life with a solitary cowboy who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "The right place at the right time," Fiona echoed softly. "Some might call that fate." Logan smiled, drawing her closer against the cooling evening air. "Whatever name you give it, I'm grateful. For every moment. Even the difficult ones." "Especially the difficult ones," Fiona corrected. "They're what make the good times all the sweeter." As the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning 10 years before, Logan Mitchell pressed a tender kiss to his wife's temple and silently renewed the promise he'd made the day he cut her free to protect her, to cherish her, to love her with every breath remaining in his body. It was a promise kept through a decade of shared joys and sorrows, and one he would continue to honor for all the days to come. For in the vast, untamed landscape of the Wyoming Territory, Logan and Fiona Mitchell had found something rare and precious, a love born of compassion and courage, tempered by adversity, and destined to endure long after their own story had passed into legend. In the years that followed, their ranch became known throughout the territory, not only for its fine cattle and horses, but also as a place of refuge. Travelers in need, women escaping difficult situations, children who had lost their parents all found temporary shelter and lasting kindness at the Mitchell homestead. "You can't save everyone," Logan would sometimes caution when Fiona's generous heart led her to take in yet another stray soul. "No," she would agree with the quiet wisdom that had only deepened with time. "But we can help the ones who cross our path, just as you helped me." And so their legacy grew, not measured in acres or cattle, but in lives touched and changed. Their children grew up understanding the value of compassion, watching their parents extend a helping hand to those in need without expectation of return. Margaret, their eldest, inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's steady nature. She eventually married the son of a neighboring rancher, combining their properties and continuing the family tradition of hospitality. James, thoughtful and adventurous, studied law in Denver before returning to Wyoming, where he became an advocate for fair treatment of settlers and native peoples alike. Little Elizabeth, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's determined jaw, showed an early talent for healing, eventually training as one of the territory's few female doctors. Through it all, Logan and Fiona remained the center, the foundation upon which this extended family was built. Their love, which had begun in the most desperate of circumstances, only deepened with each passing year, each shared challenge, each quiet moment of understanding that needed no words. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the house grew still, they would often sit together on the porch, hands intertwined, watching the sun set over the land they had tamed together. A cowboy who had once cut a woman free from the cruelty of her kin, and the woman who had found the courage to build a new life from the ashes of the old. Their story, whispered around campfires and retold in the saloons and general stores of a dozen small towns, became something of a legend in the Wyoming Territory, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, love could take root and flourish, transforming not only 2 lives, but countless others touched by its enduring grace. And if you listen carefully on a quiet Wyoming night, with the wind sighing through the pine trees and the stars bright overhead, you might just hear the echo of their story, a love that began with an act of mercy on a dusty plain and grew into a legacy that would endure long after the Wild West had faded into history.